And if you're able to get properties that work now, even if you're not cash flowing a whole lot, you need to make sure that the numbers work. But as time goes on, I think that this is going to have been a window where people look back at it and say, oh man, I really should have bought then.
Hi, I'm Wyatt. And I'm Grace. And you're listening to our dad and your host of the Vacation Rental Revolution podcast.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Vacation Rental Revolution podcast. I'm your host, Shawn Moore, and we're back with our Experts Corner Friday interviews with experts in the short-term rental industry. And we've got one of the best joining us today, Miss Avery Carl, and she's from the Short Term Shop and three-time and counting #1 EXP team in the nation here, and so always working with short-term rental investors. I told Avery before we hit record that she's one of my kind of business crushes in the short-term rental world because she's one of the only holdouts that I know about that really focuses on the ownership model. You guys know we are all about ownership. We know and only work with investors who own properties. Avery is the same way, and I asked her to come on so we can riff about the real estate markets and kind of what's going on, what we're seeing, the kind of the weird feeling out there between the buyers and the sellers. And then we'll also cover a little bit about the short-term rental markets as well. And so, Avery, thanks for joining me. This is #2 for you on the podcast. I appreciate you coming back.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. Always happy to.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I asked you to come on to have this conversation because there's not, when it comes to buying, selling, having a finger on the pulse of what's going on in these markets. I mean, you've got offices, if I'm correct, in over 20 markets across the U.S., hot short-term rental markets in the U.S., but also just because you're, as an investor yourself, working with a lot of investors, you have a finger on the pulse of what's going on. And this is a really weird market right now for a lot of people because it doesn't feel like a buyer's market at times. It doesn't feel like a seller's market. There's a lot of different things. And sometimes we have to take some of those feelings away and just look at the numbers. And I know that, I always say, hey, listen, strip away the numbers, but let's really talk about the market as you see it. And because I think that there's arguments on both sides that it's not really a buyer's market. It's not really a seller's market right now. And that can be really advantageous as an investor to be able to, spur some conversations that maybe you wouldn't be able to have with as limited inventory as we have right now, because right now we still have really limited inventory in a lot of markets. Even though inventory levels are going up and, it's still really limited as far as total homes on the market. We just have buyer demand that's down a little bit too because of interest rates are so high. So there's three things that are kind of working against us, if you will, which is low inventory, high prices haven't really dropped, and high interest rates. And those are difficult things to navigate as a buyer. But as a seller, you feel like, holy crap, nobody's looking, nobody's buying. Like, what do I do there? Right. And so as a buyer, we think it's a seller's market. As a seller, we think it's a buyer's market. So it's kind of teeing you up for a number of different avenues that you can run down there. But what do you think about that as we start talking about that?
All right. So I do have a few stats here to share with you. So Before I say that though, real estate is very market specific.
Yes.
So what's going on in Phoenix, Arizona is not what's going on in Milwaukee. So just understand that before you want to at me and be like, but we're in a seller's market. Yeah. We have people lined up. I don't care. We're talking about, across the board. Fewer homes were sold in both 2023 and 2024 than the last 65 years. So that includes 2008, 9, 10. That includes the dot-com bubble. The real estate market itself, even though prices are still high, is dead. The deadest it's been in my parents' even lifetime. Yeah. So that's something to keep in mind. The reason for that, obviously, because interest rates almost quadrupled basically overnight. And everybody likes to say, well, they were 20% in the 80s, but they didn't go from 2% to 20% over the course of 6 months. That really, really shocked the real estate market. So real estate market's dead across everywhere, especially in vacation type markets. So here in Florida, been hit pretty hard. A lot of the areas that a lot of people flocked to during COVID, especially the no income tax states like Florida, Tennessee, Texas, we're seeing the biggest slowdown in those types of markets. That is good news for investors, but also, there's definitely some caveats that come with that. Every single seller that we get to us at the Short Term Shop, we've got over 200 listings right now, which is a a ton. That's a lot of listings across all the markets. We have a joke in not just at the shop, but all real estate agents right now is you want to be in this market, you want to be everybody's second listing agent because sellers still don't want to believe that they can't get that 2021 price, or, their neighbor last year got 50,000 more than we're telling them we can list for. What happens is we're seeing more expired listings than we have since before COVID. So since 2019, because the first agent, back in 2021, you'd go in and tell a seller, I'm going to get you more than anybody else can. Yeah. And you could slap it up for $500,000 too high and it would get sold. So there's a lot of agents still using that model. We call it buying the listing. Just, I'm going to get you more than anybody else. Then they take the listing, hope they can get it sold. But, they've got that contract signed. So we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Those chickens will come home to roost at some point. Well, they come home to roost 6 months later when the listing expires. And then the second agent, they typically, what will happen is sellers will say, my agent didn't list it hard enough. They didn't work hard enough. But the market has already kind of shown them over the last 6 months or year, however long their listing agreement was, hey, maybe it's the price. And guys, it is always the price. It is 100% the price. There's a price for which everything will sell. And if you've had a listing sitting on the market for 6 months and it's got pretty photos and looks great and your rental history is good, it's the price, guys. And nobody wants to hear that. But once it's sat on the market with the first agent, they blame them. They go to the next agent. Next agent says, hey, I think maybe we need to lower it. Then they give that agent a little bit more leeway. They lower the price some and it sells. So you always want to be the second listing agent in a down market. So sellers are still not to the point of realizing it's not 2021 anymore. They still get anchored to those high prices that they saw. What's good for you guys, listeners, as investors right now, is that in a lot of the short-term rental markets, like the big vacation markets, like Shawn and I focus on, you've got all the breathing room in the world to offer on every single property, offer low. We just bought a condo in New Orleans, which is not a vacation market. It's just a place we like to go where we live at 30A, super small town, not a lot of city stuff. So we shoot over to New Orleans all the time to do city people things, go to football games, things like that. We were able to get $60,000 off of a $675,000 or $700,000 condo because we said, hey, not trying to be jerks here. Condo's been on the market for 6 months. There's another one that we also really like that we kind of can't choose between. And we're just going to offer low on both and see who bites. And this one happened to bite first. So you can do those kinds of things. You can go offer on every single property without the competition of 1,000 other buyers offering on every single property that you're offering on, like 2021. Now, the problem is it's harder to make numbers work. But with the right price, you're able to do that. So I think buyers' problems in this market is that they automatically swipe left on listings because they don't like the price. Oh, the numbers don't work. Numbers don't work. But there is a price. There is a number at which they will work. So just offer that number. Worst case scenario, they tell you no. They go home to their husband or their wife and they maybe make fun of you for a minute. And then their property still sits on the market. And you can always come back around. So anyway, I could keep going on that for a long time, but I will let you.
No, I love it. And I'll just, as much as the sellers have been conditioned to, hey, I'm looking back at 2021 prices and 2022, and they're so high and we're sitting on those prices. Buyers also got conditioned that they have to move really quick. And if it's listed at a certain price, they think that, okay, I'm just moving on. Like you said, swiping left. And that is absolutely not the case as a buyer either, because you're right. It probably is listed too high. When you see it and it doesn't work, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, right? The numbers have to make sense. But now is a time to be making and starting those conversations and saying, hey, listen, here's where it does work. And if you had a property, Avery, that was listed too high, I'd call you up and say, Avery, I love this property. It's awesome. I can't make the numbers work where it's at. What do you think about X? Would this work for you? Does something like this work? And you tell me, heck no, Shawn, I've been on the market for 2 weeks. I'm not going to come around. That doesn't work. I can't believe you insulted me with that offer, whatever else. That's the worst thing that's going to happen, right? And they never call you back. Best case scenario, you say, okay, awesome, Avery, I get it. I hope you get that price you're looking for. But listen, I really do like the property and I really would love to make it work at this price. If that price ever comes into if it's not selling and it's not working out the way you want, know that I'm here. Here's our number. We can't tell you how many times people come back around in these types of markets, right? This is what we did when we were buying properties in 2008, 9, 10, and they were going down, right? And sometimes we would make an offer and in a time where, prices aren't really sliding like they did back then, but properties are sitting on the market and they're priced too high. And you're exactly right. It always is the price. It doesn't matter what it is. If it's not your agent, it's not anything else. The market is large enough. There's enough eyeballs on it. If it's priced correctly, it will sell. I used to always, when I would, back in the day when I was selling real estate, I would tell a seller, you're not going to underprice or overprice your property. You almost can't. If you underprice it, it's going to get bid up to where, if you're too low, people are going to bid on it and you're going to get multiple offers. If you're too high, you're not going to sell, and you're going to have to be somewhere where the market's going to allow you to sell it. But I think that the conditioning comes on both sides of the aisle. And as investors, some of the things that we have to get used to having conversations about, hey, here's a good property. Here's where the numbers do work at. And if we can make them work, maybe the seller's there, maybe they're not. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of these properties are sitting on the market for 90 days, 6 months. And then all of a sudden, that next agent comes in, and or the agent that's got it at the very end of the deal says, hey, listen, my buyers are more willing to consider, or my sellers are willing to consider the price. Where you at? We start that conversation over again. And I think it's important as an investor to know that that's the environment you're in, and you've got to go out and start having conversations and making offers at the numbers that work. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to say yes to you, but you're not going to ever get a yes if you don't ask.
Yeah. And I think something else that we need to remember, especially if you're in vacation markets, like if you're in a New Jersey primary home market, this is not for you. But the sellers who have their properties on the market right now are more of what I call need to sellers than want to sellers. People who are doing great, having a great time, loving short-term rental life, loving investor life. They're not listing right now, which is part of the reason why we have such low inventory, because sellers don't want to put their house on the market in a high interest rate environment, have to take a hit on the value because they can't make it work at the price they want for buyers with a high interest rate. And then they usually, to 1031 exchange, then have to turn around and become buyers in a high interest rate environment. So the people who are doing good, maybe they've got some equity, maybe they want to sell it at some point, they're hanging on right now. So the people who are out there are people who need to. So go out there and throw out those low offers and keep doing it, because they don't have it listed because they don't need to sell it, as much as their agent might say, well, my seller doesn't need to sell it. Yes, they do. They may not, but yet here we are with the property on the market. Somebody needs to do something, or else it wouldn't be there.
Couldn't agree more. And I think that is, a really, really important point for people to realize when you are seeing, there's, when you start to see these homes on the market, the homes that are coming on the market, especially in our markets that we're looking at. And Avery made the point at the very beginning that every market is different, right? A lot of times we look at numbers across the board. We look at national numbers, and we look at, whether it's inventory, whether it's appreciation, whether it's, days on the market. And it is so different depending on what market you're in. You come into these vacation home markets, the only people selling are the ones that need to sell. And when you have a seller that needs to sell, it's also a really good position to be in as a buyer, because then you can have some conversations on the negotiation. We are finding as well, a lot of these are not, they're not trade up buyers, right? They need to sell because they bought, a lot of times bid off more than they could chew. They thought, okay, I'm going to just jump into this market. This is the, short-term rentals were the shining star and the big hot topic at the, right after COVID. And everybody's like, I'm going to, it's like crypto, I'm going to go buy a vacation home and I'm going to make all kinds of money and it's going to double in value in a year and blah, blah. Well, when it didn't happen and the brakes hit on the market and came back to a normal market, which was going to, and everybody's like, oh, man, the short-term rental game is over. Nothing really, that blip was never going to last anyways. And we're now at a normal market. Well, you had a lot of people that jumped in. They're not their primary homes. They don't have to live in them. They bid off more than they could chew on a second home side of it. And they're like, I have to get rid of this. I can't cover this mortgage if this house isn't making me money. Right. And a lot of them aren't taking the time to learn how to make money with that property. And they're not willing to do the things it takes to make money. That's a whole different conversation that you and I can have. But when you see a for sale sign go up, understand that seller is usually needing to sell that house, and they're willing to negotiate a lot of different things. I can't tell you, Avery, how many properties on a weekly basis, at least 4 to 5 properties on a weekly basis in our group that we're picking up at amazing seller financing terms. And like where the buyers are coming in, they're putting like as an investor, I just bought one, I'm putting 10% down. So agents are getting paid. The sellers are getting, some of their equity. Most of them don't have a lot of equity in this situation anyway, in some of these markets at this stage. And so the sellers are getting paid on it. We're taking it over, and we're getting seller financing on deals that we normally would have never been able to negotiate. And I mean, and it's a pretty fun game right now, picking up properties where sometimes you don't even have to come in with your own financing, and you're getting, I just bought one at 4% interest with a 5-year balloon. I'm like, it's awesome. And it's a really good time to be having those conversations. And the reason those conversations are available is the people that are putting a for sale sign up, and again, this is a long-winded kind of exclamation point on the point you made, is they need to sell, right? They're people that don't need to sell are not typically selling right now. They're sitting on their lower interest rate mortgages. They're sitting on, a property that they can afford, and they're going to wait it out a little bit before they decide to put a for sale sign up.
Yeah. And I think, there's 3 things that you have to do correctly in any, not just short terms, any real estate investing. You have to buy right. So you have to buy the right property. You have to finance right, which a lot of people screwed up trying to go too fast and over leveraging and getting like $500,000 HELOCs and putting themselves in situations where their property has great rental, like the gross income is exactly what it needs to be. Yet they have a $500,000 HELOC. So they're trying to basically pay 2 mortgages with one property, and that's never going to work. Yep. So they had to do that right. And then you have to manage right also. You have to do all 3 of those things correctly to be successful. And not everyone is cut out for entrepreneurship. And yes, this is an investment. It is somewhat passive. You have to do work. But, the people who, when something breaks, like for example, I could divide our successful clients and our not successful clients into successful or not successful categories based on just one response to how things happen. So we've got a few who, when something that is just normal home ownership things that break, like the water heater breaks, the successful clients get on the phone. They're like, hey, do you know any plumbers or whoever fixes water heaters? I don't even know. Plumbers, handymen. And they call, oh, that one didn't answer. Going to the next one. Let me Google, let me get on the Facebook groups. Let me I need to call 20 of these guys and figure out who can get here the fastest. Those people are going to be successful. The people who aren't or haven't been are the ones who will call me, their agent, when their water heater breaks and say, Avery, the water heater broke. Whose responsibility is this? Well, it's your responsibility. Well, the seller had to know. The seller knew the water heater was going to break, and they didn't tell us. They didn't disclose that. And I'm like, well, listen, I can tell you with 100% certainty that every single water heater in whatever town we're buying in is going to break at some point. And then they'll go, okay, well, do you have give me a plumber. So I give them a plumber. 2 weeks later, I hear back from them. They're like, hey, I'm losing a ton of money. I can't rent to anybody because my water heater's broken. I'm like, what the hell? This is 2 weeks ago. Why is the water heater not fixed? Well, the guy you called me didn't answer. So call somebody else. Like, the people who will not take control of their own destiny and just, oh, well, you know what? This guy didn't answer. Got to get to the next one and not wait. Just stop waiting for other people to do things for them and then come back to me and be mad because the one guy I recommended didn't answer the phone and you never tried him back. So it really is just you have to have that entrepreneurial mindset and the willingness to adapt and pivot when something isn't working and to kind of take control, then like wait for things to kind of fall into place or for other people to do them. Nobody's coming to save you.
No. Yeah, exactly. That's what we have that all over our wall here. Nobody's coming to save you. It's your responsibility. Self-reliance, personal responsibility, extreme ownership is the only way to build that life you don't want to take a vacation from. That's what we say all over here. And you're exactly right. That's success in life, period, is saying, hey, listen, I'm going to take ownership of my problems. I'm going to go out and fix them. I'm going to figure it out. Or I can fall victim to my problems and ask who can solve this problem for me? Whose fault was this? All these things. Shit happens. Things happen. If you own a property, I was just on a coaching call this last week and somebody's like, man, I feel like I've always got $200 worth of stuff every month that just kind of pops up, and I'm like, $200. I mean, you should be, first of all, budgeting that for maintenance, deferred maintenance, and things happen. Right. But it was kind of that conversation of, is this really what happens? And I'm like, yeah, this is what happens when you own properties. This is what happens when you do stuff, when you run businesses, when you want to take a couple steps forward. Sometimes you take a step backward once in a while and you fix it and you move on. Right. And so it's, and so let's transition that into kind of where the short-term rental markets are, right? Because there's a lot of people who feel like, I hate the word that markets are too saturated. I don't buy into that idea at all. I think you and I have talked about that before a little bit, but saturated markets are an indication of demand. And so it's our job to go figure out how to get our unfair share of business and get our unfair share of that demand. And if we don't do that, then it's our own fault, right? It's our own responsibility that we didn't, one, buy the right property. We didn't set it up correctly to deliver a really good experience, and we didn't articulate that experience better than the other people out there. We didn't give the consumer a reason to pick ours over somebody else's, right? And if you're not going to dive in and first take responsibility for that, then I typically don't have a lot of sympathy for your underperformance, and I don't believe in underperformance. I think properties perform exactly how you set them up to perform, and there are markets that, I'm also, one thing I'm not a huge fan of, Avery, and you and I may or may not disagree. I don't even know your opinion on this, is I'm not a fan of those, hey, here's the top markets that you have to invest in, because I think it's a musical chairs. I stopped doing a top 10 market report because people think it's gospel when you say, here's the top 10 markets we're looking at. And that has nothing to do with why we say that. These are markets that try to give people ideas, because I believe you can find good properties in any market. Now, are some markets easier to succeed because of the ratio between the acquisition and the revenue? Absolutely. And those are things we look at as investors. But, I'm not a fan of, here's the top 10 markets and this is where you need to invest. Because I promise you, the next top 10 list is not going to have those same top 10 on it. Right. And they're marketing tools for us to generate interest in these markets and things like that. But again, I get kind of long-winded on some of this stuff, but the point I want to get your opinion on is, where do you see the short-term rental market with demand and saturation? And would you add anything to kind of some of the things that people and investors have to navigate if they are going to play this game?
Great question. And yes, I hate the lists. I actually did an episode on my podcast a few weeks ago where we went through all of the lists, and not one of all the lists that were publicized in January, and none of them had the same markets on them. Yeah. And some of them were number 1, Detroit. Right. Okay. Yeah. So they're whatever. They're just marketing tools to get to the top of Google. So, so where do I see it? And where do I see it going in saturation? And, I did read something interesting when I was doing research for that particular podcast episode, that AirDNA published something, which sometimes I agree with them, sometimes I don't. It's the best data we can get right now. Price Labs is pretty good. Take everything with a grain of salt. Yeah. But they had places like Joshua Tree on their best list of best places to invest years ago. Then they rolled them off because, it's saturated. But now, because the demand for Joshua Tree is still huge, and, insert other markets here, Smokies, Panama City Beach, Park City, that now that the supply has shrunk, so something like 20% more supply came on in 2021 at the height of things. Now the tide's kind of gone out on that, and it's a more manageable supply growth, like 3 or 4%. So now that we're not seeing this huge supply growth, that market is back on the top places to invest, because while that supply quit growing, the tourism did not quit growing. So kind of illustrates your point with some data that I prefer a quote saturated market, because they get saturated because the demand is there. Yes. Because, we down here, I live in 30A. There are 10,000 of us who live here. There are 10 million people that come here and stay in vacation rentals every year. And I would much rather fish in a pond of 10 million than in a pond of 10,000 or 1,100, because I wanted to trailblaze and go, buy something where nobody's ever done it before. I want to see a track record of successful people. I know I have the ability to be successful. So if we're going to a place where there's a lot of successful investors, that's where I want to be. So absolutely. I'm a fan of saturated markets, because, as you said, they're saturated for a reason, because the demand is there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. It's what we've been saying for years. In fact, in 2022, I was on a guy's podcast, and he was saying that Blue Ridge and the Smokies were dead. I don't know if you know I did this or not, but I was on somebody's podcast, and we were kind of going back and forth, and he said, you can't buy in these markets anymore. He mentioned Destin, the Panhandle. He said Blue Ridge markets, the Smokies, they're all dead because they're way too saturated. You can't make money in them anymore. And I was disagreeing with him. Well, then that week I got kind of I was kind of still frustrated about the conversation. I got on my podcast and I started talking about it. And I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do a public case study. I'm going to go buy a property in one of these in the Smokies or Blue Ridge. And I dove into those two markets. And I said, I'm going to do this year-long case study to show you guys that the right properties, the right, business plan and the right structure on setting it up and knowing how to market it and doing those things that we're talking about, standing out in the crowds, is a really viable market, because it's way easier to do that, in my opinion, than go try to create demand when there's no demand, right? And go try to go to a small market with very little demand. It's harder to do that than it is to go out where the eyeballs are already at, where the money is being spent, and stand out, because there's very few people that will do that. And we did this case study, did it for a year. I did multiple podcasts on it, the whole acquisition phase, the setup phase, the marketing phase, and then did a full year on the market. And we were the number one 3-bedroom property in that market. And we bought it at almost 8% interest. And we bought it at, it was at the highest prices at the end of 2022. And that property is still one of our best investments. But it's because we went in and got our unfair share of business, right? Because I truly believe it's easier to do that than it is to go try to find these undiscovered markets, because guess what happens in undiscovered markets? Tomorrow, they're not undiscovered. If they do have a lot of people start coming and you do have that demand start coming, and you still have to figure out that skill set to get your unfair share of business, because you're never going to operate toward the top of these markets unless you do so.
Mm-hmm. And even, at the end of the day, if you're like, oh, the next big market, it's still very much speculation. I prefer
100%.
history than to speculation. And, one thing that I would bring up about where a lot of these lists get published and talked about is to look at the amount of real estate that the people publishing them have.
Yes.
Because I think it's very easy to look at a market like, let's say, Detroit, for example, and say, yeah, well, the cash on cash return across the board there is really, really high. Memphis is another one. That's actually a better example, because I'm from North Mississippi. If we needed to go to the mall or something, we go to Memphis. My sister lives there. Memphis is really cheap across the board. Your cash on cash return might look really good across the board because the real estate is cheap, but you forget about CapEx. Things like, I know at least 3 people in my personal orbit who have had their cars stolen in Memphis in the last 6 months. How are you going to handle that with your guests? Are you somebody that knows Memphis well enough to know which streets and which little areas may or may not be good to have a short-term rental on because of the crime rate in Memphis? So I think a lot of people get caught up in looking at, oh, I'm going to buy this because it's cheap. But then they forget about the CapEx piece about, well, why is this cheap? Is it cheap because there's not a lot of demand here? Because there's not a lot of tourism here? Probably. Or is it cheap, because I'm going to get my air conditioner stolen, which does happen in rentals in Memphis. So nothing against Memphis, wonderful city. I do love going there. But you have to look at those intangible things like that when you look at cheap real estate of, okay, why is this cheap? And where is it going to cost me elsewhere in what I don't spend on the property? So for me, I'd rather come down here and buy $1 million house in Destin because I know exactly what I'm going to get, than go buy somewhere cheap that's undiscovered and still be not pure speculation, like educated speculation, but there's nobody with a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? Well-established history of tourism and demand.
Yeah. And it's that local knowledge too, which is why we are huge proponents of finding a really good local realtor and agent, and, kind of a plug for the short-term shop, right? It's why, like you said, right? It's finding the experts in your area that knows what streets you should be buying on and what streets you should avoid, right? And there's every market has micro markets within it. And you can only see so much with the data tools, right? We can run a lot of data, but you could look at one street. We all know just, in an area you're familiar with, there's a street that divides kind of the good place and the bad place. And you could say, well, I'm 1 block away from these really high producers, but I'm on the wrong side of the street or the wrong side of the tracks. And it could be a big difference in your revenue. And you're not going to probably know that if you're an investor I'm in Utah and I'm buying in Florida. I'm not going to know those roads, right? I need to find somebody like Avery and her team to work with because they're going to help me navigate that. They're going to make sure I don't overpay. The other thing that's really hard to run numbers when we're running revenue numbers is, we were talking about as a buyer, you don't really know if that list price is too high or too low. You know what works on your pro forma, and we look at it from that standpoint. But I don't know every single market, and I don't know if I'm overpaying or underpaying for a property. Well, I found a property the other day, or about 2 weeks ago, and actually it's been almost a month now. We're waiting on it because we want it, and I really want it. It's by the Bourbon Trail. It's on 12 acres. It's got a pond. It's got everything I want, and we really want this property. Well, my agent there is telling me, she said, Shawn, it's about $200,000 overpriced. I'm like, man, I like it. It works, but when I don't want to pay $200,000 overpriced, and on paper, it looked pretty good where I could make it work pretty close to their list price, but it's overpriced, and we're waiting on it. She's right. It's sitting there. They're not getting any traction, and we're just going to wait on it until, like you said, the second agent comes in and probably lists it and gets more realistic on the price. But I wouldn't know that as an investor if I'm not working with the local experts, the best agents in the business who really understand us as investors as well, which I think is a brilliant thing that you guys have built at the Short-Term Shop in all the markets that you guys cover as well, and do just an amazing job with it. And so, plug for anybody listening, if you're looking, just go to the Short-Term Shop and look at the markets that Avery and her team cover, and make sure you've got that person in your corner to make sure that you're stacking the odds in your favor as you're going into these markets, right?
Yeah. I'm really, really happy to help you. And I've seen it, like there's a street in the Smokies, beautiful views, everything seems great, but it smells like the dump. And it doesn't smell like the dump every single day. It's only when the wind is right. So like you can't possibly know that. A guy sitting behind a computer looking at spreadsheets cannot know that. You can only know that if you're driving by every day because you work in that market. Same thing, down here in 30A, we had somebody who was like, oh my God, I found the best deal ever. And it was in an area called Nature Walk, which is like primary homes. They're a little bit smaller, but it's right across the street from Seaside, which is big money. And they're like, it's right next to Seaside, and Seaside, this same house is making $500,000. I'm going to make $300,000 a year on this $1 million property. We're like, no, you're not. No, you're not. Nope. No, you're not. It's not the same.
Seaside. Yeah. Not the same. The dumps story is so funny. I live in Utah, right by in northern Utah. We've got a big Hill Air Force Base here, and there's an Air Force Base here. So there's a lot of people coming in and out of a city right around the base, and there's a big dump that's really close to the base. And there's this area that like everybody here knows that those houses just don't sell very well. They sit on the market because in the summertime, when it gets to be 100 degrees, it smells horrible, right? But people coming in from out of town that are moving here from the base are like, man, this is really nice. It's right by the mountains. It's beautiful views. Everything looks really good about it. And the prices are depressed comparatively speaking to the rest of the area. And almost inevitably, that's who buys in that area, and they don't know. And it's because they're not being told. They're finding it online. A lot of military people will they're used to just moving in and out of stuff and making quick decisions. But the summertime comes, they're like, holy crap, this is horrible because it smells like the dump. And so, yeah, you're exactly right. You'll never know that on unless you're working with somebody with that local knowledge, because you're never going to find that online. And so,
right.
It's interesting. I think that when you look at the numbers and why I stay really excited about the short-term rental market, particularly, is the overall demand, the overall money being spent almost market by market from the consumer. It continues to go up. It continues to say, like, the consumer continues to say, we prefer short-term rentals as an accommodation choice. We love, they become mainstream at this stage. I mean, I saw a report that's anticipated 11% annual growth on the dollars being spent from now until 2033, taking it from like a $1.2 billion industry to almost $330 billion industry. I mean, and it makes sense to me. I mean, for a couple of years, I kept being shocked that the money being spent in these markets just continued to skyrocket. Right now, supply went up as well, so everybody's fair share of business went down because supply skyrocketed. Now we're seeing supply start to slow a little bit, but it's still growing. But and it might slow again this year. My personal predictions for this year, and I'm curious about yours, are we're going to have another year similar to like 2024. I don't think we're going to see big interest rate drops. I personally think that they're going to hover about where they're at. I think supply will continue to drop a little bit, but I think it's still going to be a challenge when it comes to inventory, interest rates, and prices for a little while still. And maybe prices come down a little bit, but with tariffs and everything else, it's like that shoe of dropping on tariffs is going to make the cost of construction go up, right?
Right.
Labor costs are going up, material costs are going to go up, which means the housing prices are going to continue to stay higher. And that second shoe has to drop with taxes, and we're still waiting to see what some of that stuff is going to be. And then ultimately, though, interest rates are going to be tied to inflation, and if inflation goes up, I think they're going to stay where they're at, or maybe even a little higher. So I think we're still navigating that for a little while. The good news on the back end of it, the short-term rental market, I do believe that the consumer is saying, hey, we like this. We like these types of accommodations. We like staying here, and we like spending money here. And we continue to see really strong growth on that side of life. And so we got to figure out how to make the numbers work and get our unfair share of that business. What do you see as far as like what? I know these are kind of pulling out our crystal ball, and we don't really know for sure. But what do you think about that?
I agree mostly. So here's kind of what I think. I think we're not going to see a whole lot of movement in the market this year. Maybe we will towards the end of the year, but it's certainly not going to be like a big jump.
Yep.
I think that this time that we are dealing with here is a very good opportunity for investors. I do think that, everybody's like, oh man, too bad in 2008, I was 21 and slamming tequila in downtown Austin and not buying real estate. I think that in a few years, people will look back at this and go, oh, crap. Like I should have been buying when nobody was buying, even though the rates are tough. Real estate, especially, I think people, what they get wrong about short-term rentals is they expect to get rich immediately.
Yep.
Real estate investing is a very long-term game. And if you're able to get properties that work now, even if you're not cash flowing a whole lot, you need to make sure that the numbers work. But as time goes on, I think that this is going to have been a window where people look back at it and say, oh man, I really should have bought then. I should have kept buying. Or, the best time to buy real estate was always yesterday. Everybody's always looking at, oh, should have done it yesterday. So I think we're definitely in one of those windows. I think that when rates do go down, I do think at some point we are going to see a buyer surge again because everybody's been sitting on the sidelines waiting to do these things. And, one other thing that I want to call out is I read an article, I think on Housing Wire recently. So it's not my opinion. I don't care about politics. I don't give a flying shit about who anybody voted for or myself. I'm never going to inject anything I say about politics into anything. So, but I did read an article on Housing Wire that in the first 17 days that President Trump has been in office, he has taken 35 actions, whether it's executive orders or different things that are aimed at affecting the housing market. So that's a very short amount of time for a lot of things. So I am watching very closely to see, President Biden didn't really seem to have any motive or interest in the housing market. So he didn't really do anything about it. But in 17 days, 35 things, that's a lot of movement. Now, whether you agree with him or not or whatever, who cares? That's still a lot of actions taken. So I'm watching very closely to see if someone who is leading the country is this involved with messing with all these real estate things, what might happen?
Yeah.
I think, still really the biggest thing at play is inflation and what the Fed decides to do. But I'm watching a lot closer than I have been just to see, all the different little pieces that might affect the housing market and see, because at the end of the day, guys, the housing market is dead. And primary homeowners are the main concern for the government, them not being able to afford houses. And they can't, it's like double for someone to even make a lateral move. If somebody needs to move, maybe they had another baby, that maybe they're relocating. It's like double the price, double the payment for them to even make a lateral move. And that's something that can't continue, that I think the government on either side of the aisle is working on, which we as real estate investors will hopefully be able to kind of reap the back end benefits of them artificially moving the housing market for us. So keeping an eye on that too. But I think this will be the window. I don't think we're going to see any big movement in the next few months, but I think that it is, it's on the way.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that there's a huge, that it's going to come anytime soon, but I would agree 100% that we're going to look back and say, man, I wish I was buying a little bit more back then. I wish I wouldn't have sat there, because I think you're going to have a buyer surge. Now, I don't think the government, because of housing affordability, I don't think they want a big buyer surge, right? And so I think they're going to try to keep that at bay as much as possible. And I'm with you. It's, I can't remember who said it. I just heard somebody say, not watching the policies and the politics, or telling somebody in real estate not to pay attention to that is like telling a farmer not to pay attention to the weather. And I agree with that. It's true, right? We should be paying attention to what's going on, because it's going to possibly affect what the housing market does. And I think it's something that we're all going to watch. And so Avery, this has been awesome. I love just talking about this stuff with you, and appreciate you letting other people listen in on this conversation. So I know you just released a new book. I haven't read it yet. I want to get it because your first one was awesome. And yeah, we got a number 2 coming out, Smarter Short-Term Rentals. Tell us a little bit about that and where people can find it.
Yeah. So the first one I wrote in 2020, it was more of a primer of how do I choose a market? What's a short-term rental? How do I analyze all that stuff? It builds a little bit on that just because the market is different than it was then, but it's more about the business side of your short-term rental. You can buy the best property in the best market and still fail because you didn't run your business right. So this one is more about optimizing your business, standard operating procedures, systems, and processes. Awesome. And where should we point people? Where can they go find more of this and more of you? All right. So if you want to follow The Short Term Shop, it's at The Short Term Shop on Instagram. If you want to follow me personally, it's at the Avery Carl. Of course, if you want to become a client, order the book, any of the things, go to theshorttermshop.com. The book's also on Amazon. You can walk into a Barnes & Noble and get it in person, which is pretty cool. That's awesome. But the best deal is going to be on biggerpockets.com/smarterstr. Awesome. So we'll post all of those links, you guys, in the show notes for sure. And have not read the book. I will be getting a copy of the book, but I have no problem endorsing it because I know Avery and all the work that she does. I know it's going to be an awesome book. And so, Avery, again, thank you so much for joining me. This has been awesome. Those of you listening, we know how valuable your time is, and we appreciate you spending it with us. And at the end of every episode, you guys know I don't run ads, sponsorships, or anything like that. So the only way the show grows is if you guys share it. So if you know somebody else would like to walk into the short-term rental game with their eyes wide open, share the show. Those things help us. If you have more than 30 seconds, like it or review it on whatever platform you're watching or listening on. And the final, most important thing I ask you at the end of every episode, pick that one thing you can do today to start building that life you don't want to take a vacation from. Cheers, my friends.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Vacation Rental Revolution podcast. Share this with other people you think need to hear about it. And don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. Hey Grace, is there a website? Yes! For more amazing content and expert advice, visit Vodacy.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.